They came to take my mansion at midnight, but they never realized they were walking into a legal trap they built themselves. I still remember the sound before I saw the lights. The low hum of two sheriff vehicles rolling across my gravel driveway cut through the silence of the Colorado night like a warning I couldn't ignore. I was standing in the upstairs hallway of my 8,000-square-foot home, barefoot on the cold hardwood floor, watching red and blue reflections move across the walls that had belonged to my family for more than 50 years. The smell of old oak, fireplace ash, and fresh coffee from the kitchen was still hanging in the air when I heard the knock. 3 slow hits against my front door. Not a neighbor, not a delivery. Someone who believed they had the authority to enter my life and take what was mine. When I opened the door, I saw Sheriff Daniels standing there with a folder in his hand. Behind him was Victoria Whitmore, the president of Silver Creek Estates HOA, wearing a perfectly pressed coat and the same confident smile she'd carried for months. She looked around my property like she was already imagining it without me. "Mr. Caldwell," the sheriff said calmly, "we're here to enforce a property seizure order." For a moment, I didn't answer. I just looked at the papers in his hand. I looked at Victoria, and then I looked past them at the driveway where my grandfather used to park his old pickup truck every Sunday morning. Because this house was never just a mansion. It was the place where I learned what responsibility meant. It was where my father taught me how to repair a broken fence instead of replacing it. It was where my grandfather showed me that a man's word was worth more than anything written on a piece of paper. Victoria thought she was taking a building. She didn't understand she was challenging a lifetime of records, promises, and carefully protected rights. What she didn't know was that I had spent decades studying the exact kind of deception she was trying to pull. But I didn't reveal that yet. I didn't argue. I didn't raise my voice. I simply asked Sheriff Daniels one question. "Before anything happens, can I see the document you are using to take my home?" Victoria's smile grew wider. She thought that question meant I was scared. She thought I was finally accepting defeat. That was her first mistake. Because people like Victoria always make the same error. They believe silence means weakness. They believe patience means surrender. They believe the person standing quietly in front of them has nothing left to fight with. She had no idea that the papers she brought to my front door that night would become the same evidence that destroyed everything she had built. And as I stepped aside to let them look through the documents with me, I already knew one thing. By sunrise, Silver Creek Estates would never be the same again. The first thing people notice about this house is the silence. Not the kind of empty silence you feel in a place nobody lives, but the kind that carries memories. The kind that makes you remember every person who walked through the same doorway before you. Long before Victoria Whitmore ever stepped onto my property with her paperwork and her confident smile, this place was already part of my family's story. My name is Ethan Caldwell, and for most of my adult life, I never thought I would have to defend a home that had been standing longer than most of the buildings in Silver Creek Estates. My grandfather purchased this land in 1968, back when the surrounding hills were covered with open fields and the nearest neighborhood was several miles away. He was a quiet man who believed that if you worked hard, kept your promises, and treated people fairly, you could build something that lasted. The mansion everyone talked about was never meant to impress anyone. It was built for family. Every room had a purpose. The library where my grandfather kept his old books. The kitchen where my father spent Sunday mornings making pancakes. The workshop in the back where I learned how to fix things with my own hands. I still remembered the smell of sawdust and motor oil from those afternoons. I remembered the sound of tools hitting the wooden bench and my father's voice reminding me that shortcuts always cost more in the end. That lesson stayed with me. Years later, when I inherited the property, I made sure every document was updated, every tax payment was recorded, and every boundary line was properly maintained. I knew the value of preparation. I just never expected I would need it against my own neighborhood association. Silver Creek Estates had changed over the years. What started as a small community slowly became one of the most expensive neighborhoods in the county. New houses appeared, new rules appeared, and eventually, Victoria Whitmore appeared. She became president of the Homeowners Association 3 years before everything changed. At first, she seemed like the type of person who wanted order. She talked about protecting property values and keeping the neighborhood beautiful. But over time, I noticed something different. The rules always seemed to benefit the people closest to her. The meetings became less about community and more about control. Residents started whispering about unfair fines and confusing regulations. People were afraid to challenge her because Victoria had a way of making ordinary homeowners feel like they were already losing before they even spoke. My first real disagreement with her happened when the association claimed my private driveway needed to be redesigned to match community standards. I politely explained that the driveway was part of my property and existed decades before the HOA was created. Victoria smiled and told me, "Mr. Caldwell, old ownership does not always mean current authority." I remember those words clearly. They were spoken softly, but they carried a message. She believed she could rewrite history with enough paperwork. What Victoria did not understand was that history leaves records, and records have a way of speaking when people stop listening. At the time, I did not know how far she was willing to go. I did not know she would eventually send officials to my front door. But I did know one thing. The moment she decided my family's home was just another asset she could control, she made the biggest mistake of her entire career. Victoria Whitmore had a way of making every room feel smaller when she entered it. Not because she was the loudest person there, but because she carried herself. Like every decision had already been made before anyone else had a chance to speak. I first noticed it during a Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association meeting in the community clubhouse. The smell of fresh coffee filled the room. Papers shuffled across folding tables, and the quiet conversations between neighbors disappeared the moment Victoria walked through the door. She placed a thick binder on the table, adjusted her glasses, and smiled like she was about to announce something everyone would celebrate. Instead, she introduced a new set of property compliance rules. At first glance, they sounded reasonable. Updated landscaping requirements, new exterior standards, revised community guidelines. But when I looked closer, I noticed something strange. Many of the new rules seemed to target older properties, especially homes that were not part of the newer developments built around the neighborhood. My property was mentioned several times without ever using my name. The phrase, "legacy properties requiring modernization review," appeared again and again. Everyone knew what that meant. Victoria wanted certain homes to change until they no longer looked different from the expensive developments surrounding them. I raised my hand and asked a simple question. How does the Homeowners Association have authority over property that was established before this association existed? The room became quiet. Victoria looked at me for a few seconds, then gave the same polite smile I had seen before. "Mr. Caldwell, communities evolve. Sometimes individual preferences have to make way for the greater good." That sentence told me everything I needed to know. She was not talking about community. She was talking about control. Over the next few months, the pressure increased. I received notices about my stone walkway, my exterior lighting, and even the appearance of the trees on my property. Each notice came in an official envelope with carefully chosen words designed to sound more serious than they were. The paper felt heavy in my hand, but the message behind it was always the same. Follow our rules or prepare for consequences. I responded respectfully every time. I provided documents. I attended meetings. I asked for clarification. But Victoria never seemed interested in discussion. She was interested in winning. Then came the meeting that changed everything. Victoria stood at the front of the room and presented a proposal involving several community improvement initiatives. Buried inside the documents was a section that caught my attention. It involved properties that the HOA considered non-compliant with future development goals. My property was listed. I looked around the room and saw other homeowners reading the same pages with confused expressions. Victoria had not just created new rules. She had created a path to challenge ownership rights without openly saying it. That was the moment I stopped treating this like a disagreement with a neighbor. I realized I was dealing with someone who believed paperwork could replace the truth. What Victoria did not know was that I had spent years working around legal documents, property records, and government regulations. I knew the difference between authority and intimidation. And I knew something else. People who depend on others being afraid usually make mistakes when someone refuses to be afraid. The morning after that meeting, I found the first certified letter waiting beside my front door. The envelope was thick, the kind of paper that feels expensive because someone wants you to believe it carries more weight than it actually does. I remember standing there with a cup of coffee in my hand, feeling the cool air coming through the open doorway, and reading the first line again and again. The Silver Creek Estates Homeowners Association had officially declared my property under review. Not because of any safety issue, Not because of any damage. Because my home did not fit their vision of the future. That was the moment I understood Victoria Whitmore was no longer trying to change my house. She was trying to change my rights. I spent that entire afternoon going through every document I had collected over the years. Property records, tax statements, original agreements. Everything was organized exactly the way my grandfather taught me. Measure twice. Check everything. Leave nothing to chance. The more I looked, the clearer the pattern became. Victoria was using complicated language to make simple things seem impossible to challenge. She knew most homeowners would see official letters, legal terms, and deadlines and immediately feel overwhelmed. That was her strategy. Confusion was her advantage. A few days later, she sent another notice. Then another. Each one added new demands. The exterior of my home needed approval. Certain areas of my property needed inspection. The association claimed it had authority to review historical structures in the neighborhood. It was written carefully, but the intention was obvious. They wanted me to surrender control piece by piece. I decided to attend another HOA meeting, not because I expected Victoria to change her mind, but because I wanted to see how far she was willing to go. The clubhouse was packed that evening. Neighbors sat quietly, holding copies of the same documents I had received. Some looked frustrated. Others looked nervous. Victoria stood at the front with a presentation behind her showing pictures of updated homes, new developments, and a future version of Silver Creek Estates where everything looked identical. Then she mentioned my property. She called it a special situation. That phrase bothered me. Because my home was not special because it was a problem. It was special because it had history. I stood up and asked her directly, "Are you saying the association believes it can take control of privately owned property because it does not match your preferred design?" The room went completely silent. Victoria paused, just for a second, but that second told me more than her answer ever could. She recovered quickly and said the association was simply protecting property values. It was a phrase she repeated often, protecting property values. But I had started to realize that those words were being used as a shield for something else. Control. After the meeting, several neighbors approached me quietly. They told me about their own experiences. Unexpected fees. Sudden rule changes. Pressure to accept decisions they never agreed with. Nobody had spoken up because everyone thought they were. Alone. That night, driving back up my long gravel driveway, I noticed the old oak tree near the entrance. My grandfather planted it decades ago. Its branches moved gently in the wind, completely unaffected by paperwork or titles or meetings. And that was when I made my decision. I was done defending myself with explanations. If Victoria wanted to fight using documents, then I would answer with documents. She had no idea that the paper trail she created would eventually become the very thing that exposed her. For the first time in months, I stopped trying to convince Victoria Whitmore that she was wrong. I stopped sending long explanations. I stopped attending every meeting hoping someone would finally recognize what was happening. Instead, I watched. I listened. And I started building a record of everything. The strange thing about people who believe they are untouchable is that they usually become careless. Victoria had spent years making everyone around her feel powerless, and because nobody challenged her, she had started believing her own authority was unlimited. She did not notice the details anymore. She did not notice the inconsistencies in her paperwork. She did not notice the dates that did not match. She did not notice that every decision she made was leaving a trail. My old office became my quiet workspace. The same room where my grandfather once kept his financial records became the place where I organized every letter, every email, and every notice from the HOA. The smell of old leather folders mixed with the faint scent of cedar from the wooden shelves. Outside the window, the branches of the oak tree moved slowly in the afternoon breeze. Everything felt calm, but I knew something bigger was coming. A week later, Victoria made her next move. I received a notice stating that my property had accumulated enough alleged violations to justify further action. The wording was carefully chosen. It did not say they wanted my home. It said they wanted to protect the community. But I had learned enough by then to understand the language behind those words. They were not protecting anything. They were creating a reason to take control. I contacted a local attorney to review the documents. At first, even he seemed uncertain. The paperwork was complicated. The HOA had built layers of procedures and references that made everything look official. But after several hours of reviewing the records, he noticed something important. Certain documents referenced authority that did not exist. Some approvals were based on rules that had been changed after the fact. The more we looked, the more questions appeared. Then came the moment that changed my entire understanding of what Victoria was doing. Hidden inside one of the older HOA records was a pattern. Similar actions had happened before. Older homeowners had faced pressure. Some had sold their properties after months of disputes. Others had simply given up because fighting paperwork and legal language was exhausting. Victoria was not creating a new strategy. She was repeating an old one. She counted on people getting tired. She counted on people wanting peace more than justice. But she made one mistake with me. She assumed I wanted a simple argument resolved. She did not realize I was looking at something much bigger. That night, I opened the locked drawer in my office where I kept the documents my grandfather left behind. The metal handle was cold against my hand. Inside were records that had not been touched in years. Old agreements. Original property documents. Notes from conversations that happened decades before Silver Creek Estates even existed. I did not know exactly what I would find. But deep down, I knew the answer was already there. Victoria thought she had discovered a weakness in my property. She never considered that my family's history might be the strongest protection I had. The room was quiet except for the sound of the old clock above my grandfather's desk. Every second seemed louder as I opened the final box of documents he had left behind. The cardboard was worn at the edges, covered with years of dust, but everything inside had been carefully preserved. My grandfather was the kind of man who saved every receipt, every contract, every handwritten note. He believed paper told the truth when people decided to tell stories. I started sorting through the files one by one. Property surveys, tax records, original purchase agreements. Then I found something that made me stop. A folder with a faded label written in my grandfather's handwriting. Silver Creek Property Records. I had seen that name countless times, but this was different. These documents were older than the Homeowners Association itself. I carefully opened the folder and found the original property boundaries, recorded decades before Silver Creek Estates was developed. The lines were clear. The descriptions were precise. My family's property was not part of the community association. It never had been. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window toward the long driveway Victoria wanted to control. For months, she had acted like the HOA created the rules that governed everything around us. But these documents showed something completely different. The association had been built around my property, not the other way around. The next morning, I brought the records to my attorney. He studied every page carefully. The room was silent except for the sound of paper moving across the desk. After nearly an hour, he looked up and said something I will never forget. "Ethan, they have been relying on people not checking the original records." That sentence explained everything. Victoria did not need everyone to believe she was right. She only needed people to believe she was confident. Confidence can look a lot like authority when nobody questions it. But facts do not care about confidence. Facts do not care about reputation. Facts simply wait. I decided not to reveal everything immediately. I knew Victoria was expecting a reaction. She wanted an emotional response. She wanted me angry. She wanted me to make a mistake that she could use against me. So I did something she never expected. I stayed quiet. I continued responding professionally. I continued attending meetings. I continued allowing her to believe her plan was working. And that was when she became even more careless. Victoria started discussing my property openly at HOA meetings. She talked about future improvements. She talked about community expansion. She talked as if the decision had already been made. She never once mentioned the original records. She never mentioned the boundaries. She never mentioned that her entire argument depended on documents that could not override ownership rights. Then, one evening, I received a message from one of my neighbors. It was a simple question. "Ethan, are you really going to let them take your home?" I looked at those words for a long time. Because the answer was not about my mansion. It was about something bigger. It was about every person who stayed silent because they believed they had no chance. Victoria thought she was dealing with a homeowner protecting a building. She did not realize she was facing someone who had spent his entire life preparing for moments exactly like this. And now, with the truth finally in my hands, I knew the next move was mine. The next few days were the quietest days of the entire battle. And that was exactly how I wanted it. Victoria Whitmore was expecting me to panic. She was expecting angry phone calls, emotional complaints, and a homeowner who felt trapped by a system he did not understand. Instead, she got silence. Not the silence of someone giving up, the silence of someone preparing. Every morning, I walked through the same rooms of my house, past the paintings my grandfather collected, past the wooden staircase he built by hand, and I reminded myself why I was doing this. This was never about winning an argument with Victoria. It was about making sure the truth had a chance to be heard. My attorney helped me organize everything. The original property records, the HOA meeting notes, the notices Victoria had sent, the documents that showed how the association slowly expanded its influence beyond what it was legally allowed to do. Every piece mattered. Every date mattered. Every signature mattered. The smallest details were becoming the strongest evidence. Then Victoria made the move we had been waiting for. A formal notice arrived stating that the HOA would proceed with enforcement actions against my property. The language was carefully written, but the meaning was clear. They believed they had enough power to force a decision before anyone questioned them. That afternoon, I attended another HOA meeting. The atmosphere was different this time. People were watching. They were no longer just listening to Victoria's presentation. They were reading the documents in front of them. They were asking questions. And Victoria noticed. She stood at the front of the room with the same confident expression, but I could see something had changed. For the first time, she was not controlling the conversation. She started explaining that the HOA was simply following procedures. She repeated the same phrases about protecting the neighborhood and maintaining standards. But every time someone asked for a specific document or a clear explanation, the answers became shorter. Then Victoria looked directly at me. "Mr. Caldwell, perhaps you should understand that individual property owners cannot always operate outside community decisions." That sentence was exactly what I needed her to say, because it revealed the entire problem. She did not see herself as a representative of the homeowners. She saw herself as the person who decided what everyone else was allowed to do. I calmly placed a folder on the table in front of me. I did not open it. I did not explain what was inside. I simply said, "I think everyone here deserves to review the original records before any further decisions are made." The room became completely still. Victoria looked at the folder, then back at me. For the first time, I saw uncertainty in her expression. She knew something had changed. She just did not know exactly what I had found. After the meeting, several neighbors stayed behind. They shared their own stories. They talked about notices they never understood and decisions they never felt included in. The fear that had kept everyone quiet was beginning to disappear. Driving home that night, the lights from my house reflected across the windows as I pulled into the driveway. I looked at the place my family had protected for generations. Victoria believed the next step belonged to her. She believed she was still in control. But she had made one final mistake. She showed everyone exactly how much power she thought she had. And now, I was ready to show everyone how much power the truth carried. The morning after that HOA meeting, something felt different in Silver Creek Estates. The same streets were still lined with perfectly trimmed lawns. The same houses stood behind their carefully maintained fences. But the quiet fear that had followed Victoria Whitmore for years was beginning to disappear. People were no longer whispering behind closed doors. They were starting to ask questions. And questions were the one thing Victoria never knew how to control. I spent that morning at my kitchen table with a fresh cup of coffee, surrounded by folders and notes. Sunlight came through the windows and reflected off the polished wood surface where my grandfather used to sort his own paperwork. It was strange how the smallest details suddenly mattered. A date written in the corner. A signature placed on a page. A sentence hidden inside a paragraph. Victoria had built her confidence on the assumption that nobody would ever look closely enough. But once someone finally did, the entire picture started changing. My attorney prepared the next step. We submitted the original property records, the historical documents, and the evidence showing where the HOA authority ended and where private ownership began. There was no dramatic confrontation, no shouting, no public argument, just documents being reviewed by people who understood what those documents meant. That was something Victoria did not expect. She was used to winning through pressure. She was used to people backing down before the facts were fully examined. But facts move differently. They do not rush. They do not need a performance. They simply wait for the right moment. 2 days later, I received a call from the county office. The person on the other end asked me several questions about the property records and the HOA filings. Their tone was professional, but I could tell they had discovered something unusual. Certain claims made by the HOA did not match the official records. The paperwork Victoria relied on was not the foundation she thought it was. It was the weakness. That evening, I drove through the neighborhood and noticed something I had not seen in months. People were outside. Again, neighbors who used to avoid conversations were standing together, comparing notes and sharing information. The community was slowly realizing that the problem was never the rules themselves. The problem was someone using those rules as a weapon. Victoria called me the next morning. Her voice was different. The confidence was still there, but underneath it was uncertainty. She asked if we could find a reasonable solution. I almost smiled when I heard those words. For months, I had asked for exactly that. I had requested conversations. I had asked for transparency. But she only wanted cooperation when she realized she might lose control. I told her I was always willing to discuss the truth. Nothing more. Nothing less. There was a long silence on the phone. Then she said, "You have no idea what you are getting involved in." I looked out at the old oak tree near my driveway. The same tree my grandfather planted decades earlier. The same tree that had watched every person come and go from this property. And I answered calmly, "Actually, Victoria, I think I understand exactly what is happening." Because by then, the question was no longer whether she could challenge my ownership. The question was how many other people she had convinced to surrender theirs. The night everything changed, I stood in the same hallway where this entire story had started. The same hardwood floor was beneath my feet. The same walls held the memories of my family. But this time, the feeling was different. Months earlier, I had watched Victoria Whitmore walk through my property line with confidence, believing paperwork and authority could replace the truth. Now, I was watching the consequences of those choices unfold. The county review was complete. The records were clear. The original property documents had proven what I knew from the beginning. My family's land was never under the control Victoria claimed it was. The HOA had crossed boundaries that existed long before the association was created. But the biggest surprise was not what happened to my property. It was what happened when other homeowners finally decided to speak. Once the investigation began, more residents came forward with their own experiences. They shared notices they had received. They shared unexpected fees and decisions made without proper explanation. One person telling the truth became many people telling the truth. And suddenly, Victoria's greatest advantage disappeared. Silence. The HOA meeting that followed was unlike any meeting I had attended before. The clubhouse was filled with homeowners who were no longer sitting quietly. They came prepared. They brought documents. They brought questions. Victoria walked in expecting another routine discussion, but the room had changed. She looked around and realized something important. She was no longer speaking to people who were afraid of challenging her. The board review resulted in major changes. The decisions made without proper authority were reversed. The disputed claims against my property were removed. The community began rebuilding trust through transparency instead of intimidation. Victoria stepped away from her position shortly after. I never celebrated her downfall. That was never the point. The point was making sure nobody could use confusion and fear to control people who simply wanted to live peacefully in their own homes. A few weeks later, I walked outside early one morning and stood near the old oak tree at the end of my driveway. The air was cool. The grass was covered with morning dew. For the first time in a long time, the property felt peaceful again. I thought about my grandfather and the lessons he taught me. He always said that doing the right thing is not always easy, but the truth has a way of surviving longer than any lie. Looking back, Victoria's biggest mistake was not challenging me. It was believing that nobody would check the facts. She believed power came from titles, meetings, and official-looking documents. But real authority does not come from making people feel small. It comes from honesty, responsibility, and knowing the difference between rules and rights. My home was never just a building. It was a reminder that patience does not mean surrender, quiet does not mean powerless, and justice does not always arrive with noise. Sometimes, it arrives slowly, one document at a time, until the truth becomes impossible to ignore.